As Lois also said, we designated this week as Happy Awareness Week in recognition of the growing interest of designing and delivering services for people as they age and the type of quality issues for people in later life. And it therefore gives me very great pleasure to pass the chair of this session to Louise Drew at Shakespeare Martineau. We've been working very closely over the years with Shakespeare to really extend the understanding, the skills, the knowledge, and really trying to look at the market issues affecting housing for people in later life. So, Louise, thank you very much for your support, and over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. So just by way of introduction, today we have myself speaking, and I'm basically going to be taking us through the research that we did jointly with the Housing LIN 18 months ago, and also to just draw out a few key themes from the latest research that isn't released yet, but that we are working towards releasing in the early part of next year, which is all to do with the retirement living market. I'm later going to turn to Wendy Griffin, who is a director at Nicol Thomas, and what we're looking for Wendy to kind of deliver to us really is how she facilitates the delivery of village living. And then to end the actual presentations, we will move to Shirley Hall, who's the Head of Innovation and Wellbeing at the ExtraCare Charitable Trust. She's going to basically be talking about what it is like to live in a village that delivers housing with care, and also to touch on some of the issues that we've obviously seen this year as a result of COVID and the impact that that's had on the retirement market. So we want to deliver this in a very informal way, so please do feel free to actually put your questions into the Q&A box, and then if you just want to make comments, then pop them into the chat box. And the last 30 minutes of the session, so we aim to finish the presentations by about 5 o'clock, we will be looking to effectively have a look at all the questions and go to the experts that we have in our virtual room in order to answer them. So without further ado, I'm going to see if the technology is going to work here. I'm going to try and share my screen, which hopefully it will work. And I'm hoping, Lois, finger in the air, yes, it's working. Okay, so where did we start? Well, we started about 2 years ago, Jeremy and I, in a very nice restaurant, actually, having lunch, where we started talking about whether or not any research had been done in the UK over the impact that could be had on the retirement living market if we could try to seek more people to actually move from oversized family homes that they were struggling to live in and move into something that was more suitable, more community-based, more durable, and delivered kind of health and well-being benefits to those individuals, and whether or not anything had been looked at, because we were very much concentrating in terms of the housing market, just looking at the first-time buyers and getting young people onto the market. Well, actually, what impact would it have if we actually looked at the older retirement market moving into more suitable accommodation, freeing up the property chain? So that's where we started with our report, which was shining the spotlight on the hidden market. And just to set the scene, to give those of you that don't know too much about this area or this sector, of the UK's 66 million inhabitants, we've got nearly 12 million people that are aged over 65 or above, and that is going to rise significantly in the next 50 years with an additional 8.6 million people. So that's 1 in 4 of us will be over the age of 65 by 2035. The problem there is that the amount of accommodation that we've actually built in this country that is specific for the retirement living market is about 1%. So you can see from those figures alone that there really isn't enough of this type of housing being built, and there remains a very heavy focus both from government and from the developers of housing on the kind of the younger area of the market. So in 2019, we conducted this survey. It was comprehensive. We had over 200 senior level respondents who operated in this space, but not just in the affordable living market, but also in the private sector, local authorities, right through to people like Wendy, architects, and voluntary associations. And everybody came together on the back of the results to effectively say, we must do more. Some of those results effectively said that only 73% believed that there was a demand for later living accommodation, and that would actually significantly increase over the next 5 years. So that's 3/4 of the respondents effectively saying that we need to build more. 90% of the respondents were saying that we need more funding in order to actually deliver, because that's one of the biggest challenges to delivering this type of sector accommodation. And then 89% felt that planning laws in particular needed to change in order to boost the later living development. As we know that there is still very little change over those last 18 months in terms of concentrating on making the planning system easier and actually understanding what retirement living is. So something that Jeremy and I discussed quite a lot kind of over the last 2 years has been this idea of the name. And I'm going to come on to that towards the end of my presentation as well, because it's still, for me, absolutely critically key that we sort out the language in this sector. So the diagram that you've got in front of you, you've got 2 different types of accommodation. So you've got lifestyle housing and you've got care ready housing. You've got 4 in each of those with a different name. The problem for me, and our recent research has borne this out, is that there are so many different names for different types of accommodation. If we ourselves might be confused when we work in the market as to what each of those actually means, how on earth can we expect the public to understand it? And as a result of that, how can we possibly expect the public to understand that there's aspirational living out there to tempt them out of their big family homes that they've been living in for the last 40 odd years, with the scary process ahead of them of having to clear the property, move into something completely different, probably a flat that they've never experienced, take away their garden, and potentially they will feel like they're having their independence taken away from them. So what has changed over the course of the last 18 months? Well, as I've already touched on, no real change with planning, no government narrative coming out in order to kind of really concentrate on the building of retirement living. And you've got local authorities who are still divided on class types, and local authorities who really don't understand what it is that the sector is trying to build. Post-COVID, however, we've seen some massive benefits of secure and well-built accommodation, and I'm sure Shirley will talk a little bit about that. Retirement schemes, whilst COVID will still have been extremely tricky for providers to keep their residents safe, they have allowed for safe occupation. They've allowed for people within their flats to have contact with the outside world in a safe fashion. Residents haven't had to worry about how they've got their shopping brought to them, and a great degree of appetite, I think, will come out of this in order to build more of these schemes. Design is also being tweaked to make the accommodation even more secure than it was, and Wendy's going to very much touch on that. And the design was good anyway, but there's other things that can be done. And we've also seen a concentration on older people's issues, such as tackling ageism, and also a demand for an older person's advisory service. And that's something that Jeremy and I and a group of people are going to be focusing on in the new year. So our recent research, it was undertaken a couple of months ago. We decided this time that we'd go out to the public domain, because coming back to my point about it's all in the name, I wanted to try and test to see what the public thought retirement living was. So we had 2,000 consumers across the UK through a YouGov study. And then we also did a mirror of those questions to providers of housing for older people. So not just in the RP market, but also in the private sector. And the key points that have come out of it is that definitely the public and the providers are not aligned in terms of language or the awareness of the offering. Consumers are quite clearly confused about the options that are available to them. And actually, again, touching back on the steering group that we're launching in January, some of the issue we've got is that there is nowhere for the public to actually go in order to find out this information, and most would revert simply to the internet. How should housing providers invest time and resource to increase retirement housing desirability? There was a focus very much on age and at what point people felt that being an older person wanting to move into this accommodation actually kicked in. And interestingly, when we did a comparison of the age group of the person answering the question, their answer was pretty much, when they were over about the age of 40, that they would expect old age to be 20 years their senior. So that was quite an interesting point that came out of it. And then our steering group that I've already touched on. So the purpose behind that is to bring key people from across the whole of the sector, a representative from everything from the private sector, the affordable sector, CIH, we've got local authority, HBF, etc. And what we're trying to do is bring that group of people together to sort out what our objectives are going to be in order to lobby for an older people's advisory service. So we're going to be looking to tackle the lack of public understanding of the options and the benefits of later living, improve the perception of later living, both locally and nationally, redefine and re-energize interest in later living to try and get it being spoken about in a common voice rather than everybody kind of going off and doing their own thing. Raise the profile of later living and combat negative association and language use. Work towards a consistent use of language to describe the services and properties offered across the industry, and to set up an advisory board for older people. So some exciting things to come in the new year. Without further ado, I'm going to now move and bring Wendy Griffin into the conversation, who is going to share her slides in order to talk about design, what good design looks like, and how she, as an architect, facilitates that. So over to you, Wendy.
Thanks, Louise. That's a very good introduction. A lot of challenges there for everybody, not just us as designers. Right, I'm going to see if technology works for me as well. See if I can share my screen with you. Right, yes, here we go. So my name is Wendy Griffin, Director Nicole Thomas. Louise has already touched on that. My email address is there if anybody wants to get into contact with me following this presentation. So who are we? Nicole Thomas, we're architects, project managers, principal designers, quantity surveyors. We've been around for a long time. 1856 we were first established, so we're a very old organisation, a very old practice, probably one of the oldest in Birmingham actually. And we operate out of 2 offices, one in Birmingham and one in Oldham, just outside Manchester. We operate or we deliver a range of projects, a range of sectors, like most architectural practices, but my particular focus is predominantly around retirement. So unfortunately, I've been in this profession long enough to remember the early days of supporting and looking after our older generation. And I have to say, the very first time I went and had a look at an old people's home, and they were after an extension to the property, which turned out to be a conservatory, I was shocked. And I think, you know, I'm pleased and proud to say that we've actually come a long way since then. A lot of learning from America, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, etc. But we certainly recognise now the expectations that our society has in terms of moving forward and really sort of looking to provide a more acceptable solution to ageing in place. And the design process clearly has a big role to play in that. And as designers, we have to anticipate some of those progressive needs. So what makes a great retirement community? Not just a retirement village, but retirement community. And I think the statement, you know, there that sort of mentions that our priorities become our defining characteristics is something that really sticks with me, because, you know, that sort of says a lot about where we focus our attentions. And so, you know, it's kind of like, well, it's all very well sort of coming up with the brief and then responding to that brief, but actually as designers, how much do we actually understand what we want that building to do and how we want it to behave? And very often I'll start by asking clients what their hopes are for the building, not what their technical requirements are, not what the brief requires in terms of budget, but what are their hopes? And then from that point, what I then tend to do is look at sort of some of the aspects that might influence that. So the first influence is me, the second tends to be around your sort of family and close friends, and then the wider community. And so this presentation really starts to look at and break down those factors that kind of assists in how that design process moves forward. So the 3 layers, that's how I sort of, if you like, that's where I start my thought process. And those 3 layers are all about thinking about how the design will functionally and flexibly be used, but in terms of the spatial preferences. So it's about starting with that sort of person-centered personal space, that then sort of leads into that sort of closed community, the convenient shared experiences, and then how that then sort of reaches out into the wider community, and how that becomes an asset for those sort of connections, not just in terms of older people's housing, but in terms of an intergenerational approach. So all of those things start to sort of link. And that sort of that simple diagram sort of becomes the starting point. So the person-centered, the sort of the me, the space that I own. And in a retirement village, it's really important that, you know, we provide an environment that people can live out their lives in a very sort of safe and personal way. And so it's about, you know, how those apartments in the old days, it would have been, you know, a bed sit, but now we design sort of 1-bed, 2-bed apartments. Accessibility is important, so they're very spacious. The inside and the outside relationship is important, so lots of daylight, lots of opportunities for windows, and also every apartment has its own outside space, whether that's balcony or a patio. So this is yours, somewhere that you can call home, something that's your own. And so some of the imagery here on some of the schemes, and you know, you can see that sort of proper fully kitted out kitchens, nice big windows to bedrooms so people can see out your own front door, but also the balconies and the outside space. They are really important, so that you can personalize them and you can enjoy them. And then we move from that sort of very self-focused personal space, which whilst is important, I think if you have too much of it, it can become a very lonely space. And so that close community then becomes quite an important aspect. And this is where the retirement village community this is where this exists. And so the retirement community sort of becomes your extended family, if you like. And we've got some images here about how that translates into the spaces. So it's very much a case of, that's the public face of the building. It's the starting point of entering into the building, and it's part of your journey to your apartment, to your home. It's the public facing, self-promoting community interaction space. And it is active, it's busy, it's easy to understand, easy to navigate. The scale of those spaces, the volumes, the materials, the furniture, all of it is a distinct scale, gives you a very sort of distinct feel. And the idea being that it actually becomes a point of destination, somewhere to go on a Saturday evening. And it's also somewhere where you can bring your friends and your family, and you can enjoy, a cup of tea or a chat, etc. So it's those layers of proximity are now starting to become much more public facing. And so this slide here shows a typical ExtraCare retirement village, and this is the village centre, and you can see the arrangement. So you can see there that it's very much about creating a variety of public spaces that people can utilise, both residents within the scheme or people from outside can actually come in and use the fitness gym, the hair and beauty, the craft room, the man shed, which is something that's become more and more popular, greenhouse. So there's lots of things, and also lots of opening sliding doors, etc., so that those spaces can actually start to spill out and merge, so that we've got lots of different activities that can take place depending on the time of year. So at Christmas, you may open that space up a little bit more, but maybe at other times of the year, you close it down because it's not required in the same sort of way. It's not used in the same sort of way. And then that third layer of proximity is, so you've gone from personal to sort of village life, and now you're sort of moving into that wider community. And this is a project that we, finished probably a couple of years ago now. It's an ExtraCare scheme, and it's part of the regeneration programme for Longbridge. And the ExtraCare, we were sort of consulted on where we felt the ExtraCare village might be located, the best position. And we selected this position because it literally sat in the centre between the existing communities. And so it actually became almost like a vehicle for bringing those communities together. And so the regeneration benefits not only extended through to Longbridge itself, but also benefited the retirement scheme. And so the retirement scheme actually became a connector, a focal point, and we were able to exploit that through the design. I've put this slide up. Shirley will go through this in a little bit more detail, I'm sure, but I put this slide up really because sometimes we need to explain what these schemes are to planners. Planners are not always aware of the wider benefits and often focus on sort of their own personal aesthetic preferences. They don't always appreciate the wider benefits, and very often, when I come up in a situation where I've got issues with planning authorities, I'll throw this slide up just as a sort of a general guidance, just to give them some ideas, some idea of what will happen. And all of a sudden, I tend to have their interest a little bit more than I probably did have half an hour earlier. So it's really important that we actually communicate better with planners. The planning system is difficult, it is challenging, but I think we have to recognise sometimes that we can contribute to that sometimes it is our own communication that doesn't always help us. COVID. what a wonderful thing we've all experienced. I think the one thing about COVID is it has actually taught us, or it's demonstrated the human aspect of lockdown, and that human aspect is isolation and loneliness, and the fact that people who probably didn't realize previously but now appreciate the importance of interaction. Interestingly, those three aspects many older people have experienced for many years. They haven't needed COVID to experience it. It's been part of their daily life. And I think this is where the benefits of living in a retirement village have actually assisted in counteracting some of those issues. And I think people are much more aware and sensitive towards that now. And I think the question is, you know, for all of the issues around COVID that have been challenging and distressing, I think the question is, will this now be a moment of change for us? You know, will people now suddenly start to appreciate some of these communities and some of the challenges that can be sort of, if you like, worked through via the design of retirement villages, flexible spaces, adaptability of communal spacing, allowing for, you know, group zones, social bubbles, takeaway services, the use of outdoor spaces, the provision of health support. All of these happen on a daily basis in retirement villages, not just during the sort of the COVID period. Jonathan Van Dam said something on TV, I think it would have been earlier this week, can't remember which day exactly, which really struck with me. And he mentioned the 3 C's and a D and a V. And basically he was talking about the virus, but for me, I translated that into volume and space and architecture. And he was saying that if, you know, in terms of the pandemic and future potential, I suppose, think about closed spaces. The smaller the space, the greater the risk. So lots of nice big spaces that kind of open up, that you can sort of break down and open up. Crowds, think about how many people you're going to cram into a space. So again, in these retirement villages, we're able to increase the volume depending on the number of people who are using those particular spaces. So the village hall, for example, we can reduce the size of that. We can increase the size of that just through the use of various techniques such as folding sliding doors, etc. Close contact, again, by providing sufficient space for people to make their journey through the village. So, you know, the corridors are wide enough. All of the journeys through the village centre itself, we make sure that, you know, you're not just walking down a corridor. There is seating, there's opportunity there for incidental social interaction, lots of daylight so that those spaces are enjoyable to sit in, that, you know, you're quite happy to browse rather than sort of rush and get from A to B. Duration, the amount of time that you spend in these spaces, and again, you know, the duration is closely linked to how comfortable a space is. So, you know, does it have lots of nice views outside? Does it have daylight? Are you aware of where you are in that scheme? Is it comfortable in terms of ventilation and warmth? Is there, you know, are there things to do in there? Is it a space that is easily and immediately understood? And then volume. And I actually thought when he said volume, I actually thought he meant size, but he meant noise. And basically what he's saying is, the more noise that you make, then obviously the greater the chance of COVID-19 spreading. So again, that relates, it does actually revert back to volume. The greater the volume, then the more space that you have and the more opportunity to distance. So what I'm going to do now is just go through a few slides that have got some images, and these images show how design quality can support a holistic approach to maximising the opportunity of living in a retirement village, maximising your health opportunities, maximising your lifespan. And I mentioned earlier on how the village centre really is designed quite specifically and quite deliberately to be a place of destination, somewhere that you will want to dress up and go to, somewhere to meet friends and family, both within the scheme and outside of the scheme, but also somewhere that the wider community will want to come in and utilise. So, you know, the bar is like a proper bar, you know, the gym is like a proper gym. And not every scheme has to be huge. I mean, this is a project, it's an urban location, it's 40 plus units. And what it's a very tight site, and so what we did here was introduce a central courtyard. There was limited opportunity for balconies, so we made the courtyard a nice place for people to come and use with the green wall and the landscaping, etc. And the importance of those outside spaces can't be overstated. Another example of an ExtraCare scheme, and this scheme, the planners wanted it to be quite distinct and immediately recognisable. So architectural features there that sort of say that this is residential accommodation, but actually it's more than that. You know, there is a commercial feel to it, and the scale of the sort of the commercial elements stands out. And again, you can see there's lots of natural daylights and lots of opportunity for people to engage in activities. But not every retirement village has to be in an urban location. These are examples of just a few schemes that we're looking at, and these are much more rural in character. So combination of blocks rather than one large building. So, you know, the design responds to the context as well as that brief. And a scheme here where we've also utilised an existing school, and rather than demolish it, we actually brought it into the scheme. And the beauty of that was it really sort of anchored the scheme within the community. A lot of people had been to school during their lifetime there, so, you know, it had a real sort of importance and a real message for them. And again, more another scheme where just an example of how we can create different types of spaces just through scale and height and introduction of materials, and how we can sort of generate that interest so that there is that variety. You know, your lounge, it's not just one lounge, it can become a big open space, it can become a walkway through, it can become a winter garden. There's plenty of things that you can do when you're designing these spaces to really provide opportunity for the whole of the scheme to interact and understand and appreciate where they are and what they're doing. And the final one in terms of sort of schemes that we've been involved with over the years, this is a concentric scheme. It's a mixed use community regeneration with a community centre that is run by volunteers. But this scheme actually contains a GP's practice, a dementia care home, an ExtraCare scheme, some general needs housing, assisted living, and women's safe place. And basically this scheme connected two streets. It was on the site that was previously suffered a lot of antisocial issues, and we basically regenerated the connection through the thoroughfare, the public realm, and we created we introduced the community centre at the heart of the scheme, and it's very, very successful. And as I say, it's run by volunteers, and everybody enjoys it. So going back to something I said earlier on about our priorities define us. I mean, fundamentally, you know, our priorities are a measure of our compassion. And I think it's really important that, you know, when we are designing these sort of schemes, that as well as, you know, all of the other technical issues that we have to deal with, you you know, the issues around fire safety, efficient construction methods, cost, sustainability, carbon neutral, etc. All of these sort of things are really important, but it's that measure of compassion, I think, that has to run through, is the golden thread that runs through everything. And the happy principles are certainly something that I reference all the way through. And I just ask myself those questions, you know, are the spaces flexible? You know, is this building a community asset? Am I avoiding an institutional feel? Is it a nice place to work, let alone live? And then also ask questions such as, you know, will it save the planet? Will it break boundaries and improve lives? Will it make the world a better place? And will it help to break down barriers? And then the final slide to conclude, good design makes us happy. Designing these buildings is a complex process, but nevertheless, you know, there are those threads of compassion that run through it, and it's those pointers that we really need to sort of push. And I think, you know, if we're going to encourage change in society's attitudes and a positive approach to aging, I think, you know, those of us involved in the design of these buildings really need to hold on to those sort of passions and just appreciate, you know, the positives and the impact of good design on what it can do to help people as they age. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. That was really interesting. I've got about 50,000 of my own questions, so if we do run out of time in terms of the number of questions that people have asked, then I've got quite a few to ask you. Right. Shirley was trying to indicate to us earlier that the picture on her darkened screen was that of her partying with residents. I think we know Shirley well enough to know that actually that isn't the case. But I'll move over to you, Shirley. Tell us what it's like to live in an ExtraCare scheme, and talk to us about the issues that you've had during this COVID lockdown.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Louise. Lois, thumbs up there. You can see my presentation all right? Brilliant. Thank you. And yeah, a lot of what Wendy talked about, I'm going to go over today in my session just now as well. But I wanted to start with our model. For us, it's about homes that are comfortable, secure, desirable, and very much accessible to older people. And we are encouraging an active lifestyle for our residents, plenty of activities, you know, lots of volunteer opportunities, as well as wellbeing advice, support for mental health. And certainly, you know, during the pandemic, we've been able to do a lot of that work and support our residents in that way. And as well as having a care service on site as well. So a 24-hour care service as and when it's needed. So we, you know, not all residents when they move into one of our locations will need care, but they know it's there if it's needed down the line. Sorry, I'm just trying to move my slides on. So lovely. Yeah, so the community then for us, it's about a mixed tenure. So we have properties that are bought outright, we have shared ownership, and then we have affordable, we have rental properties. Very much focusing on that balanced village profile as well. So it's 55 plus, and we do look at a mix of people across the various age ranges. Making sure we've got a mix of couples. We still predominantly probably have more, slightly more women than men, but again, looking at that balance. I'm kind of looking at these pictures at the moment with envy, I must admit, and remembering what it was like back in February, March time, you know, with the market stalls. It just seems alien to us at the moment, but we will get back there, you know, and you can see from some of these pictures what it is like for our residents living in that community. We've got facilities that are very much open to the community, and Louis, Wendy, you put up a picture of our Longbridge site and talked about that. And I think for us it's very important having the open access. So one access opens out onto the main road, there's a school opposite, you know, and we very much get people coming in, having a coffee in the bistro. So you get that mix, that intergenerational mix, and it's not just an intergenerational mix with young people, with children, as you can see here, you know, but school mums, you know, childminders, other grandparents, and that village really does have that community feel. People coming in to use the hairdresser, people coming into different events. You can see here on the bottom left of the picture one of our open days, and that's very much where we get people coming in to join in and find out what it's about. So the homes, I've put here smart homes. The picture top left, you can see there of the balcony. Again, you know, Wendy talked about those balcony spaces, and particularly during the first lockdown period, we had a lot of residents going outside onto the balconies. We had a great summer, so they were enjoying that. But we had our exercise instructors going outside and actually encouraging, you know, a whole side of the building to join in balcony exercise together. We had singers out in the car park and entertainers that couldn't come into our environment, but they were able to do so outside. And, you know, a lot of our residents said that was absolutely fantastic. It was a godsend when normally they would have probably been quite isolated, having to be within their own home. One of the things that our residents do tell us, they want to feel secure. A lot of people as they get older, you know, are worried about where they might live, and they want to feel safe, they want to feel secure. But they also want it to be accessible. You know, some of our residents say to us they don't want that gated community. They want it to be open during the day, as I've just mentioned, but then at night when they go into their apartment, feel secure, that they might not have done in a community where they were previously. Outdoor space as well, as Wendy said, it's really important to have those big communal areas, to have the gardens. And again, during the pandemic, even when we had 4 locations in a tighter lockdown, they said it was great to be able to go outside and have that space, to be able to walk either on their own, with a, you know, a neighbour nearby, and just know that there were other people around. But in terms of smart homes, we have been looking an awful lot at the use of smart technology. And this is a picture here you can see of our double robots. We've got a double robot at Stoke Gifford Village and at Wixham's Village. And they were part of a smart technology project we had with the University of West England, and the lab there, the team there. Great again during COVID, because we were able to use those devices, because you can actually remote from your own laptop. You can drive them around the village, you know, if somebody puts them in the lift and takes them upstairs, you can go to the apartment door, and if somebody's got, you know, a smart Ring doorbell, somebody's able to open the door remotely as well. All those sorts of devices we're now starting to showcase to our residents, so we can try and give them a flavour of what else they could have to make life easier for them. What the Stoke Gifford Village did down in Bristol, they used the double robot to actually do virtual exercise sessions. So for those residents who couldn't come down, perhaps when they were isolating, you know, we know people have had to isolate for a couple of weeks at a time on occasion, they were able to have the double robot in the gym, and then a resident would have an iPad in their apartment and be able to see the session, or vice versa, would take the double robot up to the apartment. And then at Wixham's Village, they used this to take it round to different residents who were isolated, who were lonely, who were on their own, so that they could FaceTime or video call with GPs. So I think, you know, we did a technology survey actually back in March for our staff and residents, and we have seen an increase in residents who are using devices. People who probably previously wouldn't have done have been forced to. So there's been some real positives. There's been obviously a lot of negatives as well, but it's enabled residents to see the benefits of this sort of thing and to be able to use it. So going back to the lifestyle then, again, this is normal. This is what our villages look like when we're not in a pandemic. So the woodwork room there, top right, you know, we've had villages making all sorts of garden wheelbarrows, fixing chairs for the residents. It's normally a hive of activity. Interesting, the bottom picture, bottom left, are bars. It's one of the questions we get asked all the time at the moment: when can the bars be open again? And it's trying to explain that it's really fortunate that in an ExtraCare environment, we have been able to open our restaurants and bistros in the tiers and enable residents to at least go down and have a meal and have a drink with the meal if they want to. But the facilities that we've got there, you know, the village hall, as Wendy said, being able to open up the village hall into a much bigger area. We have a lot of movable walls, so that if you've got parties, you've got big events, you're able to have that bigger space. And especially when we think about Christmas with those residents that will be in the location, because of social distancing, you know, we're only able to have one household per table. We can open up those spaces and make them a lot bigger. but having access to the hair and beauty salon on site, the greenhouse, the craft room, we've been able to do a lot of work and support groups during the pandemic that residents wouldn't normally have accessed. We have an activity coordinator on site and a volunteer coordinator. And the types of activities, you know, we've got, it can range from Tai Chi, from reading, book clubs, to much more physical exercise groups. And we do really depend on our volunteers. You know, we have over 2,000 volunteers, mostly residents, because they've got so much to give still. And they've helped us during the pandemic, either by taking deliveries to apartments, by helping on reception, or by helping us to continue some of our services to be able to run. I mentioned the care team on site. Again, that's accessible to those residents as and when they need it. We are fortunate because we are a charity, so our surpluses are for a purpose, and that is to go back into providing a wellbeing service. And we have an award-winning dementia and mental health support programme as well. So we have what we call dementia and mental wellbeing enablers, and they've been able to do a lot of activities, you know, phoning round residents, ensuring that we're able to continue with support groups during the pandemic. I will touch on our end of life, our gold standards framework programme, and bereavement support as well. So the wellbeing service, each of our locations has a wellbeing advisor who provides regular health checks for our residents. So we do an assessment before a resident moves in to make sure that the environment is right for them, because it's all about independent living. You know, everybody's got their own front door, their own apartment. So we want to ensure that they can live independently. But we'll talk to residents about diet, exercise, living well, and really try and put the emphasis back on the resident. So we'll talk to them about their health conditions. Do they understand it? Do they understand their medication? And signpost them back to their GP or primary care when necessary. One of the things that we have incorporated within the wellbeing assessment is 4 questions around loneliness. We incorporated that into the new wellbeing app a couple of years ago now, and you can see this picture here is what we get on the front sheet of our assessments. So as I said, we do the baseline assessments before somebody moves in, but we'll do it annually as well. So when we start asking questions about loneliness, you know, do you feel lonely or isolated? Quite often we'll find residents will say, yeah, that's why I'm coming to move into an ExtraCare location, because I have been lonely. I don't see my family anymore, they've moved away. And so we'll pick that up right from the beginning, and then have an opportunity to signpost residents. If they have been lonely, we'll ask them, what do they normally like doing? What are their hobbies? What are their activities? Would they like to volunteer? And quite often those residents that are lonely want to be able to participate in activities. So right from the beginning, from before they move in, we're hoping to identify that. And we ask them about their social networks as well. So you can see their social score is their social networks. Are they in touch by phone, by email? How many people come and visit them normally? And again, we'll follow that up every year. We can follow it up anytime a resident comes to see us. But this just gives us an indicator and an idea, as well as you can see their physical resilience, their cognitive resilience, and also we can pick up any anxiety and depression. And then in terms of addressing loneliness, I just wanted to touch on a project that we've had going for over a year now. This was funded through the Community Fund with the Big Lottery. So it's about trying to address those residents that are still lonely, because not everybody has a big access to a big group of friends and family. So when we've identified them, we want to be able to try and help them develop relationships, you know, trying to build their resilience. So this is a book that's coming out in January, and I believe we're going to promote this through the Housing LIN newsletter. But this book builds upon engaging lives workshops that we've been holding with residents. So we've had a lot of resident feedback on this. They told us what worked, what they liked, what didn't. So we've shaped this with older people. And they can work through this book in a group on their own. And I think it's just in trying to give them back the power and the ability to build on their resilience. So if anybody is interested in that, we will be offering discounted rates to any organisations. So you can either get in touch with me afterwards, but we will also put the email address of Michael Roberts, who's been leading on this campaign. In terms of bereavement support, we again fortunate to have a project with the Big Lottery Fund that we've actually, we're coming towards the end of that. I think we're in year 4 now. And we've been training up our residents to become our bereavement volunteers. So who better to speak to other residents who've been bereaved than our residents themselves? And again, building on, you know, a wide range of abilities on previous roles in society. We've got ex-nurses, GPs, people who've worked in healthcare, people who've just said, you know what, I've been bereaved, I know what it's like to go through that, and I want to help and support others. So we've been rolling that out to all of our locations. And of course, when COVID hit, we had to adapt. And the team adapted very quickly. So we've developed a lot of online learning. We've done training by Zoom for our staff and our residents. And actually, we've found that we've had a better take-up for our staff because they know they don't have to travel somewhere to do training. They can join online, they can do it from home. So it's been really successful. And our bereavement supporter, our resident volunteers, have continued to support others by phone. Sometimes it's just by talking to them. They might catch somebody in a community area, and just by asking them how they are, if they know somebody's been bereaved. So again, we just need to make sure that we continue to do that. We do know that a lot of our residents were affected in one way or another over the last year by a bereavement. It might have been by another resident, it might have been they'd lost a family member. So we wanted to do something as part of Dying Matters #IRemember Week at the end of October. And this just gives you a flavour of what some of our locations did. Memory trees were very popular, that we've put a memory tree up in an area that residents can put a little tag on and put a little message on, and just remember somebody who has died over the last year. Intergenerational focus, I mentioned that earlier, and we're very fortunate that some of our locations have things like a stay and play. Bottom right picture there is Sue from Longbridge, who was a nursery nurse. She had her own childminding business, and she actually came to us and said, you know, I'd really like to do something in this village. I think there's a real opportunity to support the local community. She's done her homework and said, you know, I know that there's not a lot of facilities locally for parents, for grandparents and for childminders. And that programme there is just an absolute delight. If anybody's been to Longbridge and is able to see the stay and play when it's normally up and running, it's just fantastic. The village hall once a week is got lots and lots of different stay and play areas. And in fact, Sue's come to us now and said, do you know what, I think we're getting more babies. So when we do open again in the spring, we'd like to have more facilities, more activities for babies and young children. Just wanted to touch on the research that we've done since the pandemic. We actually partnered with Aston University and sent out an online survey to ask our residents, how did they feel during the pandemic? I think we all knew there was going to be a second wave, so we wanted to learn from what we did well in the first wave and what we maybe needed to do differently. So you can see there 90%, over 90% agreed with our lockdown measures, even though 40% said it affected their mental health and they did feel socially isolated. Importantly, 80% said they felt safe living in an ExtraCare location during national lockdown. But we did have residents that were frustrated about the lack of physical exercise, particularly with those 4 locations that went into a more stringent lockdown because of cases locally. But what we have done is taken some of that, and in this second wave made sure that we've got more opportunities for exercise, more access to health services. Things like having our physio students in the Birmingham locations has meant they've been able to do virtual sessions, or they've been able to do telephone calls or sessions within the gym. I did just want to touch on the research. Some of you will know we did some research with Aston University over a 6-year period. And this is a sort of thing that we found living in the ExtraCare environment. 86.5% of residents were never or hardly ever lonely. Really important, but that's why, because there are a small percentage that are lonely, we've been looking at the projects like the Engaged Lives. 75% of residents saying they increase their exercise. And then things like improving memory or decreasing their anxiety symptoms, because they've moved into an environment where they've built that community. They've been able to access lots of volunteering opportunities and support groups, and building up their local support networks. So just to finish there, just wanted a reminder really that what we're trying to do within ExtraCare and within all these retirement communities is to challenge the current rather depressing view of old age and create better lives for older people, because that's exactly what our residents and staff say, that it is certainly living in a retirement community is better lives for older people. And I will stop there. Back to you, is it Louise?
Thanks, Shirley. You're bang on time as well, so well done. That's brilliant. So we've got 30 minutes for Q&A. We've got 9 questions in there. There's one theme that has within those questions that I just want to pick up on to start with, because I think it's quite fundamental. And it does feed into the research and the discussions that Jeremy and I very strongly feel about. It's all in the name, and it's about choice. So today, obviously, we're talking about ExtraCare housing. ExtraCare Charitable Trust tend to specialise in kind of big schemes. Wendy mentioned that you can have much smaller ones. I touched on the different types of retirement living that there are. And we've got a theme coming through. Elaine Hollahead has raised it. Simon Evans has asked a question. And one of the things that we've talked a lot about residents living in the schemes and the huge benefits that they get from being there, but it's about the resident's voice that is kind of coming through in these questions, and how early on the resident's voice can influence what is out there. So Elaine has effectively said, so this is really kind of, I'll throw it out to all of you. I know many older people feel pressurized by society to relinquish their larger homes. One of the difficulties there, Elaine, is that there's very little choice. So if people do want to, if they might feel pressurized, but sadly, if they make a decision that they do actually want to move into retirement living, there's hardly any choice out there. I mentioned the statistic of 1% at the beginning. Simon Evans says, how can we ensure that older people have a meaningful say in the design of ExtraCare and other forms of later living life housing? And then Elaine, again, just to try and kill various birds with one stone. It's not scrolling down. Hold on. Said, do we agree that in later life people should be able to choose the type of accommodation to move to, or to stay put rather than have community living imposed on them? Now this session is very much based around village living, but does anybody want to just kind of jump in about residents and the residents' voice? Because we're adding a resident onto our steering group because it's absolutely essential that they do have a voice.
Can I just say that when we, in the majority of situations, doesn't happen in every single situation, but in the majority of situations, we will always go back and visit a scheme when it is probably around about 12 months old, 12 to 18 months old, and we put up stands and we spend a day there, and we present a Meet the Architects days, and those are publicised within the scheme before we do that. And it's interesting, those sort of comments and the communication that we get back, and we do tend to feed that back through, and we feed that back to clients as well. Obviously, we take our brief from the clients, but ultimately that feedback does generally have a value, and it does, we do try and sort of learn from those experiences. So from a design perspective, we do spend time with residents and we do ask questions, warts and all, and we're quite happy to take those on board. And it's interesting because older people aren't stupid. There's an awful lot of people who are highly experienced, educated people who can, offer some very sensible and some very valuable suggestions. And certainly from my perspective, it's always a day that I enjoy.
Can I just add to that as well? Very much along the same lines, Wendy, we're consulting with our residents constantly. And so whenever we've built a village, we'll absolutely, as you say, ask for their feedback. So I think it was at one of our villages, the feedback was, well, we're getting a lot of wind coming through the doors, so next time we need to stagger the doors. The lift's in the wrong place, you know, actually that doesn't make it easier for us. So why did you only have one lift there when we need 2 lifts there? So every village will make some adaptations, and it's usually on the feedback from residents. Obviously staff as well, staff will feedback and say, you know, this would make our life easier in terms of supporting residents. But the residents' voice is really important. So we've got residents also on our technology group. So when we're looking to do something different in terms of technology, we'll ask, and it's not just one, it's 2 residents, you know, what do you think about this? And those 2 residents we've got on the technology group have got a lot of background, a lot of experience, but as you say, not stupid. They know exactly, you know, what works for them. And I've spoken to residents in our locations who've said, do you know what, I didn't want to move here. It was my son, it was my daughter, you know, I felt that I had to move. I think we do it all the time with our parents. Oh, you know, why don't you do this, mum? Why don't you move? And they need to be ready. So it's about, you know, giving them those choices, isn't it? And giving them the opportunity to look at something like a retirement community.
Lou, what strikes me is this is not about tokenism. This is very much about how to ensure that residents are involved right from the outset. And so whether it's the way we design, as Wendy has described, or Charlotte said, around the way we support and enable people to participate, I think what ExtraCare Travel Trust do through their ambassadors and governance arrangements, you know, really sort of good practice examples that with the social housing white paper out at the moment, where we've got to think about better ways of engaging, is a good way to think about more proactive mechanisms to consult and engage residents right from the outset.
Okay, brilliant. So I'll start at the beginning because it's a good design one for Wendy. What have been the biggest design changes as a result of the current pandemic? That's from Darren Clark. I think Darren actually put that up. I do know Darren. I think he put that up. So over to you, Wendy.
I tell you what I think the biggest change is. A lot of schemes, very few schemes now are sort of are very small and pokey, and much more schemes now, more providers, more clients, more developers are much more conscious about good design and some of the qualities that you can bring into it. So, you know, things like windows and natural ventilation and that sort of thing is automatic. The one thing that I have seen that people are suddenly almost become sort of focused on is outdoor spaces. We are now starting to see a lot more roof terraces. The value of those outdoor spaces are now becoming much more important to these schemes. And I think it is the fact that, you know, that lockdown, it kept everybody indoors. If you have a balcony, then that's great. And certainly every single scheme, unless there is a really good reason why not, every scheme that we produce will have a balcony. And as I demonstrated on the smaller scheme, if it hasn't got a balcony, it has a very good quality, contained, safe courtyard. But we're now seeing that roofs are being used for roof terraces now, as well as those features. So I would say that's the biggest design influence. There's an awful lot of other things that we're doing naturally, but that's the biggest design influence.
Excellent, that's great. Okay, so we'll crack on. Another good question from Phil Morgan, this one more towards you, Shirley. Sustainability of schemes, I mean, they're not cheap to run, are they? Huge communal areas that need to be paid for. Have there been issues with safety costs impacting on service charges?
I'm not so sure about safety costs. I mean, there are obviously charges, so we're very upfront with the charges before a resident moves in. So there's a community charge, there's the amenity charge, the service charge, but we'll absolutely say, you know, if you want to have a receptionist on site so that you are safe, if you want to have a care team at night so that you know somebody's in the building, and the activities, you know, the activity staff, the manager, the lifestyle manager, that's all incorporated within those charges. We are fortunate, as I said earlier, that we are a charity, so that we fund the majority of the Wellbeing Service and the dementia and mental health services ourselves. So yes, it's making sure that just residents do understand those charges, because we'll have some residents who say, you know, that's really expensive, I probably couldn't afford that. But there again, our welfare benefits team will talk to them, work out what benefits that they can access that they maybe weren't benefiting. So that's why we try and ensure that the service is affordable for as many people as possible.
And have you seen much of a difference in terms of charges just because of COVID, and any additional stuff that you've had to put in, I suppose, to look after people?
It's a really interesting question, because we have talked about that, because we have spent, as you know, so many people have, a lot of money on PPE. It's great now we're accessing the PPE through the hubs, but in terms of things like the screens, you know, the sanitizers, we have had to purchase a lot of that. But we've worked really hard. We're fortunate again that we've got a COVID governance team who are going back and trying to reclaim those costs through the local authority funding, and so far we've been fairly successful. Undoubtedly, you know, we've taken a hit. And so some of our activities, our technology, our innovation, for example, we've had to pause for the time being and focus on what's important and what are the priorities for residents.
This is a critical area, Lou, and it's an area that the LIN is very keen to explore. And in fact, hopefully next week, we're making a statement about some research that we want to do with a partner to take this forward. And it's one of the things we've noticed over the last 8 or 9 months is yes, it's been the PPE that Shirley's highlighted, but also it's the increase in communications as well. So, you know, I think Louise and the work she's done in Coastline that you featured as well, part of the Shakespeare Martineau webinar series this autumn, you know, the sort of the click and the collect and connect area, you know, sort of additional phone calls, keeping in touch, and the social value that has in terms of reducing loneliness and isolation.
Excellent. Okay, the double robot is very popular, Shirley, as I thought it might be.
Yeah.
More information about the double robot, cost provider. You mentioned the robot. Could you tell me a little more about the uses of this piece of digital equipment?
Yeah. Essentially, it's an iPad on a stand, but what is great is you can move it. So I actually did a presentation here in the office to Stoke Gifford probably over a year ago now. Did it by Zoom. So again, it was a time when we weren't all using Zoom, but I zoomed into the village hall. So I was able to deliver the presentation, but you had the robot on the stand. I could move it. So I could move it from my computer and I could move it round so that residents could talk to it. In reality, I couldn't do 2 things at once. So I didn't use it an awful lot on the day, but where it's been successful is being able to, you know, like I said, take it to apartments or put it in an apartment so that you can just move it around. You could go and have a look in the kitchen, for example, you know, see if things have been used, go into the bathroom with residents' permission. But residents have been surprisingly a fan of it. They've liked it. They've realised that they can communicate with something like that. So it is really quite a simple piece of kit. It's not cheap. It's about 3,000 or 4,000. But we, again, it was part of a knowledge transfer partnership with Bristol that we were able to purchase 2 of those. I'd love to have one in every site. But again, you could just have an iPad that you take round. You haven't got the same control access, but it's certainly, if you've got one scheme or a small care home, fantastic to be able to move it around and see what residents are up to and keep in touch with them.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I'm going to throw one in here, which is something that I found really interesting that Wendy mentioned. We all know that Longbridge was such a successful site because you've got people in the community that worked there that moved in and have kind of refreshed friendships and all the rest of it. Wendy, you said about the fact that you had got some influence over the position of the land that ExtraCare bought there. And that got me thinking, because how often, when we know that land is at a premium and it can be quite difficult to kind of find sites that are suitable, how often does that happen? Because that sounds fantastic that you as an architect can actually discuss with the client the position of the site, because there's, you know, options around you in order to fundamentally get the best village.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely the right place to start. You know, strategically, it has to be something that needs to be considered. Very often we're presented with a site, and whether that site is big enough or in the right location, we don't have a great deal of control over. Generally speaking, if local authorities are involved and if it's local authority owned sites, then we can get involved very quickly, and Birmingham City Council have been excellent with us through the design process of all of the ExtraCare villages. The Longbridge site wasn't local authority owned, but the developer was working closely with the local authority, and the advantage and the value that the retirement village brought to that development was really important. And so the developer was very keen to work with us. It opened doors for him elsewhere. It basically allowed him to develop out the housing because we were delivering this for the local authority. So if we can get involved strategically, very often if you've got a local authority who appreciates the value of an ExtraCare scheme, irrespective of the size and the facilities that are included, then it can put you in a very strong position in terms of where those facilities go. And you know, I say it every time, Longbridge is such a good example. We've created a link from one side of the road to the other side of the road to the new shopping development, and all we've done is created an internal village street to do that. And as Shirley said, people use it, they use it as a shortcut, and it's absolutely perfect because you get that foot traffic through, and it means you get that intergenerational. It feels like somewhere that everybody uses. It's not a gated community, it's not just for old people, it's actually sort of revitalized the whole village, retirement village, as well as the area of Longbridge. So to answer the question, not very often, but when we do, it's a real advantage, definitely.
So really, for those listening, engage your architect sooner, because actually there could be huge benefit by instructing early. It goes with lawyers as well, everybody, if anybody's out there. Okay, so another quick one, staying with the design bit, because I think you'll answer this pretty quickly, Wendy. So was sustainability considered during the design of the retirement villages?
Yes, it is. It's not, again, we are confined. There's so much that we have to deliver technically in terms of the brief. And by technically, I don't just mean how it's built, but technically in terms of the space standards and what we're providing and the cost, etc. And so some of the obvious things can be quite expensive, you know, photovoltaics and things like that can be quite expensive. We always start with fabric first. Always start with fabric first, and I think once we've got that, then we tend to sort of add on some of the other sustainable elements. But as a principle, fabric first. It is the least maintenance hungry response to delivering these schemes. The bigger schemes are more of a challenge, definitely.
Are you seeing more of a move towards MMC anywhere with your client base?
Yes, we are, and we're currently working on a scheme where we're looking at that potentially. It, again, strategically, it's a decision you have to make very early on in the design process, because a number of times we've achieved planning approval, we then start talking to a contractor, and all of a sudden the client wants an MMC type solution, and you can't do it because you've got to change the design. So the design is quite specific to that form of construction. So strategically make that decision early and then stick with it. And yeah, I think the advantages of achieving that. The challenges, I mean, you know, let's be honest, some of those constraints can be challenging in terms of design, but as designers, we're problem solvers naturally. So that problem solving is actually an enjoyable process. And I think, yeah, we definitely think we should be seeing more of it, but let's make that decision very early.
Lou, that's a really good question about the MMC, and it's something that the session tomorrow morning will touch on as well. So we have a specialist who looks at MMC and off-site manufacturing, who's going to be talking about how that can help facilitate some of the community aspects as well.
And to be fair, these buildings do lend themselves up to that, because there's an awful lot of repetition. You know, and so the economy of scale and that repetition, it's a no-brainer. But it's not, these are not just blocks of flats, and there's lots of things that we still have to understand and iron out around, you know, sort of warranties and who's responsible and all those sort of things. So it tends to be those things that tend to sort of block it, not the solution itself. But yeah, there's a lot of repetitive units. Why not?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Right, one final question from the audience. What is the way forward on financing ExtraCare? I don't think any of us are specialists in finance. I don't know whether Jeremy feels that he can kind of contribute to that question. Otherwise, Lois, would it be good to take that one offline and get someone to kind of give an answer?
I mean, just to say, we have a number of resources on our ExtraCare housing web pages which look at financing, both in terms of how you fund the development costs through grants as well as other inward investment opportunities. And another thing, which is a really substantial area, is obviously the revenue side. So not the capital, but again, the day-to-day running costs, whether it's housing benefit eligible, whether it's around looking at self-funder market. And again, we've got a lot of resources on the website. So if there are questions, do post them on the micro site that we have or on our website, and we'd be very happy to take questions on those and respond to those.
Brilliant.
Oh,
Okay.
Lois has just posted the site up on the web, on the chat box.
She's quick, isn't she? She's got trigger fingers, obviously. Okay, I've got one because it's been mentioned a number of times, and I know Jeremy and I are talking about this all the time. Wendy talked about intergenerational living and obviously taking that into the external community. I think that's quite exciting at the moment in terms of where that's moving towards. Influenced quite heavily, I think it will be anyway, by the build to rent market. And post-COVID, where people can actually live in, again, a secure apartment block that's not necessarily set just purely for retirement living, but they've got younger people around them and all the rest of it. Do any of you have a particular opinion over whether or not more generally retirement living with everybody living together in the same place is actually going to move forward over the course of a number of years to something that looks more multi-generational? I keep saying it's not one size fits all. So, you know, is there scope in the sector to have something that's not just retirement living, but actually something that is multi-generational?
If I can just jump in there, I think the biggest issue in delivering that in the simplest form is the planning system and the planning uses, and the various issues around what that might introduce, whether it's SIL section 106, parking provision, etc. So I think that is probably the biggest challenge. I think it is something that we should be looking at, and it may be that we look at it in a slightly different way. So a little bit like the scheme that I put up that had the GP surgery, the ExtraCare, the dementia, the general housing, general needs housing. So that was all sort of clustered along a public realm that focused on a community hub. And so that community hub became the focus of that intergenerational, but each element had its own sort of planning use and therefore wasn't complicated by those sort of grey areas. I mean, that's just a very practical response, because when we're looking at these schemes and we want to develop them, we want to get them through planning as quickly as possible. And so the cleaner you make your planning application, the quicker it's going to go through.
Shirley, any views in terms of residents?
Yeah, so we as ever get lots of feedback from residents. We get criticised for calling it retirement living because it's 55 plus and some of our residents are still working, they're not retired. So we've had lots of discussions about, do we just call it a village? Do we change it to 60? Do we change it to 65 plus? We've got no answer to that, but I think there's got to be lots of provision. So that what you've talked about, I think it'd be great to see that. We've talked about the student accommodation. Is that something we'd consider in the future? Because we know some schemes have looked at that, having the students who will live there and then provide some volunteering, working for their accommodation, if you like. So I think it's got to be, a mix of different models so that there's something to suit everybody. I don't think there's, as we've said all along, there's not one size fits all.
We've got I see Lois has posted a report that we did for Architectural Design Scotland, which looks at different models of intergenerational living in a programme they called A Caring Place. The key thing was not about the schemes, but about the types of communities that are being built. And so again, there are, I think, going to be a variety of different intergenerational approaches, both within retirement villages, but also in virtual villages and other forms of housing, as Angela highlights, like co-housing. And it's something that we'll be exploring a little bit more on Thursday when our regional chair for East of England, Geeta Prasad, who got a Winston Churchill Fellowship to look at these issues in Holland, Scandinavia and UK, will share some of her findings with Stephen Burke and others. So if you are interested in intergenerational living, we've got a really great session on Thursday as well.
Superb. Right, another one for Shirley from the audience. During the pandemic, have you had to increase the communication with families of residents to deal with anxiety about safety?
Absolutely. So We've, as you said, done a lot of communications. We've had residents' bulletins, we've had posters we put up in the location, but we've also, when we've had restrictions perhaps in some of the villages, we've text next of kin, we've had text messages for powers of attorney, we've put information on the website. So we really had to have, you know, we've had to have this whole team working on it. We've had to have somebody working on communications more or less full time, producing the bulletins, producing the posters. And I guess that's not a cost that we can charge back, but we've all changed our day jobs. So we've all, you know, for me, I've been mostly working full time on, you know, supporting and addressing the pandemic, as my colleagues have. So yeah, huge amount of communication. But again, the COVID research that we did with Aston University, some of the feedback said we gave too much, you know, and we need to be just a little bit more concise and just send some simple key messages. So we've learned from that, and we're trying to keep our communication as simple as possible.
I think communication is such a difficult one, isn't it? Because getting the right balance, some people, it's almost subjective, isn't it? Some people will think it's too much, others will think it's too little. Some won't read it and then say you've not communicated at all. Are there any kind of little things that you've learned in terms of communication that you will carry on though going forward that you think has actually improved things?
Yeah, so one of my colleagues, Dave Bosworth, he right from the start said that, you know, he was fantastic in supporting the communication. He said make it very simple, make it very clear, but we started to do a daily comms with all of our staff so that all the messages went out on one email instead of lots of people saying, oh, we're now doing this, or we need to consider this. And we've carried that on. We said, you know what, that was a great idea. So we do a weekly comms now on a Thursday. So still all around the COVID messaging, but people know to look for that, or we'll do an urgent comms. And Dave also, you know, created lots of animations, so very simple pictorial images which our residents and their relatives prefer, so they can see very quickly at a glance what that means. I mean, just taking, for example, the Christmas bubbles, how many people are confused? I know loads of people who've said, you know, I'm doing this, and I've said, well, that's not legal, because they don't understand, because there's so much information. So we've tried to make that as simple as possible. So animations, pictures, you know, keep it simple.
I think the other thing we've seen in the LIN is that the use of digital has really transformed the way people are communicating. So whether it's through email and the sort of messaging that we've heard from Shirley, but also Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups, and, you know, the old-fashioned telephone as well, dare I say it.
Sorry, one more thing I forgot to say, Louise, is we created the virtual village. So it's a Facebook page. So we've had residents posting lots of things on there and sharing that, and they can then take back. So I think, you know, it's using all different kinds of social media, and a lot of residents love that.
That's brilliant. So we've got about 4 minutes. Does anybody have another question for any of us? Type quickly. Jeremy, have you got anything that you want to ask?
Well, I mean, I was only going to say this has been a really excellent session, and I think it only shows that there's so much information to be shared about the real good practice that's out there. But also what I'm hoping is that, you know, as Lois said right at the outset, this session is both being recorded, but also we'll be able to share the slides. I'm sure a lot of people will want to look at some of the drawings, some of the designs, as well as some of the examples, you know, whether it's the robotics or the communications. So on my behalf, a real big thanks to everybody. And you, Lou, for sharing so expertly.
Darren's put one in there. He's a naughty boy. What's your Christmas wish for 2021?
Vaccine for everybody.
No more COVID, I think it probably is.
Well, it's a big challenge.
Go on holiday.
It's the LIN's 10th anniversary, independent of the Department of Health. So we're really hoping that at some point we could go back offline and hold this face-to-face. So that's our biggest wish.
Superb. Well, Lois, I think that's us done.
Great. Yeah, I'm glad. Hope everyone had a great event. And do sign up to any of the events that are happening throughout the end of the week. I've put the link in the chat box, but if not, have a lovely evening, everyone.
I'd just like to say thank you to Wendy and Shirley. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone else. Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great.
Well done.
Thanks, everyone.
See you soon.
Bye.
Have a good break when it comes.